Tonight, we're going to do some general overview of what is technology, some philosophy of technology, some theology of technology. And then the next 2 weeks, we're going to get into digital technology, and specifically the digital side of things and how that affects us a little bit more. So if that's what you were coming for, tonight you can log off discreetly now and nobody will hold that against you. But there will be some key categories that kind of frame everything else we're going to do. And hopefully this will be some really good foundation. It's been really good for me over the last couple of weeks to dig into this topic a little bit more and just to have some new paradigms that I didn't even have before. I found that I have tended to be reactive when it comes to technology as opposed to thoughtful and proactive. And some of the things I've been reading and investigating and some of the resources I've come across have been just really helpful on that. If everybody could, if you're not already, mute. We will have times tonight where you will unmute, but get used to using the mute and the unmute button. We've got a fair number. Yeah, we've got a good crew of people here, but we're going to split into small groups at least one time and maybe others. If on the slides, if you can help it, don't look ahead if at all possible. That is the danger of giving you the slides, is you give away the punchlines to the jokes, quote unquote, by giving you the slides. So try not to look ahead and hang with us as we're going through this. All right, well, before we start, thank you guys all for being here. Feel free to use that chat function to keep sending in questions or et cetera, et cetera. The other thing that might be helpful is on the bottom, you have the little reactions button, a little happy face with a plus. There's two options. There's a clap and a thumbs up, neither of which is useful for raising your hand in a meeting like this, which is like the only thing you need to do in a meeting like this. They have two positive reactions but no way to raise your hand. So I will treat either one of those as a hand raise when we get to question and answer time. So
hey, can I share how to raise your hand?
Yeah, how do you raise your hand?
It should be under reactions, I agree. But if you go to participants on the bottom right, it should say his hand. But I guess it only works if you are looking at the participant list.
Yeah, that's not going to work. That's
helpful.
Just use a reaction. Just use no, that should be a raising hand should be a reaction. So, okay. Well, let's start with prayer and then we'll get going. Father, we thank you so much for all your gifts to us, including this gift of technology. And yet we know that like most gifts, it can be misused. And so we ask for the grace of greater discernment, for greater wisdom, and just for hearts that yearn for what it means to be fully human. We know somehow that this conversation is a part of that, but can be really hard to navigate. We ask for the grace of knowing how to follow you and becoming more fully who you made us to be. It's in Jesus' name that we pray these things. Amen. All right. Well, let's get started. In next slide. Full disclosure, we're going to have some various resources. Yeah, there we go. Various resources that we're going to use throughout this class. The resource that I found most useful tonight was a book called From the Garden to the City by a guy named John Dyer. He runs all the tech at Dallas Theological Seminary. And this was the best resource I've seen that is both comprehensive, but also theologically thoughtful from somebody who actually understands technology, not just a theologian talking about technology, but actually a guy who works in technology doing theology. So if the things we talk about tonight are helpful or intriguing, that book would be a great next place to go. And it was pretty accessible and very, very interesting in a lot of ways. So I want to start with an opening question. Is the smartphone mostly good, mostly bad, or just neutral, and it depends on the way we use it. Right? This is going to lead into our larger discussion, but what most of us wrestle with is the kind of digital technology that is available to us on our smartphones. So, Linda, if you could break us up into groups of 4.
Okay.
If you could break us up into groups of 4, and we're going to discuss this question. Are our smartphones mostly good, mostly bad, or are they just morally neutral and it depends on the way we use them? Did everybody make it back? If you didn't, you wouldn't be able to answer me. So there we go. Hopefully we got the majority of people back. I still have 2 screens. Yeah, this looks like most people. All right, so let's get that screen share back up, Mark, when you get a chance. Apparently that killed the screen share for the slides. All right, a show of not digital hands, but like actual hands. How many people were on the like mostly good side? All right, all right, all right. Hold on, flicking through. Oh, Mark messed me up. Here we go. All right. How many were on the mostly bad side? Anybody on mostly bad? Dude, you guys are in love with your phones. All right. Morally neutral. All right. A lot of morally neutral. Okay. All right. Well, let's get rolling here and let's figure out what it is we're talking about. We had an interesting observation in our group that it was impossible for a physical thing to have moral value. That it was all in how we used it. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. Usually when it comes to technology and our thoughtfulness of it, we are not that thoughtful. Usually it has more to do when we're evaluating a technology of whether it's a good or a bad thing by how comfortable we are with it. Next slide, Mark. There's an interesting quote from Douglas Adams, the guy who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And he said this: first, everything that's already in the world when you're born is just normal. Then anything that gets invented between then and before you turn 30 is incredibly exciting and creative, and with any luck, you can make a career out of it. Finally, anything that gets invented after you're 30 is against the natural order of things and the beginning of the end of civilization as we know it, until it's been around for 10 years when it gradually turns out to be all right, really. I think that's fairly true. I can even tell now that I'm on the other side of 30 of I'm looking at different technologies and thinking, what are these crazy young people doing? I don't know when I got old. Apparently it was 30 when I got old and started thinking that way. But often our reflection on technology has more to do with our comfort level with it than anything else. There's been this term coined, digital immigrants versus digital natives. Digital natives are those who would be comfortable, and you can think of this as technological immigrants or technological natives more generally. Natives are those who were born with it or found it very early on and are comfortable with it and really don't think twice about using it. The immigrants are those who feel uncomfortable with it, those who had to learn it later on and find it difficult. We're all experiencing that with Zoom because pretty much all of us are Zoom immigrants. There are very few of us who have been using Zoom for years. Some of us have, a few of us have, but we're all immigrants into it, and it's uncomfortable. The problem is that if you're a native to something or it's been around more than 10 years, you tend to use it uncritically and not to think about what it is you're using and why you're using it. If you're an immigrant, you tend to see it as more bad or potentially dangerous, kind of as a gut reaction, because you're just not comfortable with it. So we need to move beyond like comfort levels of things towards discernment, towards the value of various technological tools. So to make sure that we're on the same page with exactly what we're talking about in general, next slide, let's define technology. This is from this book, From the Garden to the City. Technology is the human activity of using tools to transform God's creation, so this is a theological definition, for practical purposes. So technology is the human activity of using tools to transform God's creation for practical purposes. Use the chat to point out some things you notice. You notice about this definition. What are some observations? What are some observations? It's unique to humans. Yep. Yep. And there could be some arguments that, you know, some primates use tools and things like that. I mean, once you get into you know, deeper levels of technology, there are definitely places that animals don't go. If it's not practical, it's not technology. That's a great point. One of the things he distinguishes between in this book is the difference between art and technology. And the way he describes it is art is something you behold, while technology is something you hold. It's something you use for a specific purpose. There are things that are human culture that are created purely for beauty or to communicate some deeper metaphor. The way he's describing technology is that it's got some function. It's got some purpose to it. Yep, mankind has been using tools for years. Absolutely. His definition of technology is very broad. If you think about it, it goes all the way back into metal arts, into weaving, even the way he describes it, and I thought this was fascinating, is into language. That language is a tool that we use to accomplish a practical purpose. That writing is a tool that we use to accomplish a practical purpose. Let's see here. Not necessarily electronic tools, absolutely. Leaves out the possibility of divine inspiration in the creation of the tool. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, yeah. So we'll see, like in scripture, that there are times where God actually moves our technology forward. That does not mean it's not a human activity, but you're right. God actually creates, and he mentions this in the book, actually creates technology in some cases too. Good. How do you transfer activity, not the tool itself? Yep. You guys are getting ahead of me here. All right. Some art is both functional and beautiful. Indeed. All right. We got to talk about writing. We'll talk about writing a little later on. Okay. So what I want to make sure, though, we're doing here, we're all on the same page, and I think we are, is that technology is not just digital. We often use technology as a shorthand for this. For digital technology, but really it's a whole breadth of human activity that is trying to do something practical in the world. And whenever new technology comes about, whatever it is, a couple things happen. Go to the next slide, Mark. Sorry, I was quick on you here. Marshall McLuhan is a good name to know in this. He was a media ecologist, and he thought a lot about how technology, and especially digital technology, kind of shapes our environments. And he said technology does four things, at least digital technology, several of these, all technology does. One, it extends or magnifies something that we do naturally. And that's a key piece. It is an extension of some human ability. So it's helpful to think about, in any kind of technology, what is it extending my ability to do? What normal human capacity is it magnifying? Now, when that happens, something else happens. But Monica, can you mute for me? Thanks, friend. Something else happens. When we extend or magnify our ability to do something naturally, we no longer need to do that naturally. So we eliminate or amputate something that we used to do. So every time you add a technology, something that we would have done another way gets taken away. Something is added and something is subtracted. It's never that we just add something when we add a technology in. Something is always lost when you add any kind of technology. Often, a technology retrieves something from the past in a modified form. So for example, in digital technology, with our cell phones, with texting, we used to have the ability, walking through a village, to have chit chat and little conversations with everybody just kind of on the side of everything we were doing. We lost that ability when we spread out into suburbs and cars and roads and everything else. We get a little bit of that back with technology. And often the reason technology is created is to get something back from a previous era that we feel like we've lost, but is part of who we are as humanity. So there's a retrieval that's happening there. And then 4, almost every technology, if not everyone, has the possibility of reversing into a more negative behavior when it's overused. When it's overused. This is true for any technology, McLuhan says. It's not just digital. It's true for anything. Because what is happening when we use a technology is, again, we're losing some aspect of our agency in shaping something. And over time, if that's all you're doing, then you can lose some things that are extremely valuable or be formed in ways that lose some sense of your humanity. We'll talk more about specific ways that that happens. But that's true for any technology. So we need to get back to this question then of whether technology is neutral. Whether technology is neutral. Technology shapes things. Again, it's for use for practical purposes, right? And it shapes things in 2 ways. One way is it shapes the world, all right? The major technological revolutions have all shaped our world in profound ways to the point where it's almost impossible to think about going back to a time before that. The author made the point, and I thought this was fascinating, that Abraham Lincoln's world in the 1860s had more in common with Abraham in terms of the way they did normal life than it would with us and the way we do normal life. There are profound ways that the world has been shaped by these technological revolutions. First, a couple I just want to point out as examples was the printing revolution. Bookmaking was transformative because now thought could be extended and democratized into a wide variety of people. It wasn't just the authorities or the upper classes that had access to thought, that had access to the best of what culture had to offer. And it is no surprise that things like democracy, things like capitalism, these social structures that equalized people came after the printing revolution. Profound effects on the world. The mechanical revolution, kind of 1650s to 1850s, industrial revolution. Really what the industrial revolution was doing, and this mechanical revolution was, it was extending human strength to the point to where we could now make way more things than we had ever been able to make before. Way more things than we'd never been able to make before. But you think about all those different tools, really what they're an extension are is human strength, our muscles and bones, and extending that. Then you've got the digital revolution, kind of proto 1850s to today, I said, because some of the inventions of the late 1800s and the 1900s, things like the phonograph or the telegraph or the photograph, were really the basis for everything that came later in terms of the digital world. They're really an extension of our senses and extensions of our brains. We can now calculate more than our brains can calculate. We can now see more than we could actually see otherwise. Each one of these is extending some aspect of human nature in some profound way, such that the world is massively changed as a result. But they don't just shape one way. The author uses the analogy, Dyer uses this analogy of a shovel. We can use a shovel to dig in the earth and do all kinds of good or bad things by digging in the earth. But if you use the shovel also ends up using you. The shovel also ends up shaping you by the blisters it puts on your hands, right? By the biceps that you start to gain by using the shovel over and over again. So this technology of the shovel not only shapes the world, but it shapes the person who is using it. And this is a very key thing that we don't often think about with technology. You can go to that next slide. Is all the tools we are using are shaping us as we are using them. technology always blows back in some way. Like Marshall McLuhan said, something is lost, some potential change in the way we live our lives. It changes us, it shifts us. There are two kind of views about sort of how this process works. One is instrumentalism. Instrumentalism is the belief that, yeah, it might shape us, but it barely does. It just gives us, some blisters for a day or two, and then it's okay. Really, all the technology does is shape the world, and there's a minimal blowback to us. The other view is determinism, that actually once we start using a tool, we automatically lose control over it. That it automatically starts working on us, and there's nothing we can do about it. These are kind of two different views and sort of a philosophy of technology. And I think what we'll see as we go through the scriptural story, and what most of us have experienced, is that it's actually somewhere in the middle. Every technology carries values with it. It is oriented in a certain direction. And we are shaped by those values in ways that we don't always understand or comprehend. In this way, and in this limited way, technology is not neutral. Okay, we might say it's morally neutral in the sense that it can't perform a moral act, but it is not neutral in the sense that we can use it however we want, that we have complete control over how we use it, because it is also working on us as we're using it. So examples from those three revolutions: the printing revolution in the 1500s. It was before this time, the main way you found out knowledge was from having it passed on orally to you in church, in schools, et cetera, et cetera. There wasn't a lot of access to books. Well, you can only get so much information across orally and remember it. What books were really good at was creating linear, complex lines of thought that could span hundreds of pages, right? That's what the technology of books values. It values linear, complex thought. Well, what came after the printing revolution, which is fascinating, is all the theology that was written in the periods after the printing revolution became much more complex, much more linear, much more systematized than earlier theology had been. The scientific revolution came on the heels of the printing revolution, because now people started to look at the entire world in a systematized, linear, complex thought kind of way. It's fascinating to look at how that tool shaped the history of Western civilization because of the values it carried with it that previous tools did not carry. It is no accident that after printed books became widely available, things like the Enlightenment and the growth of philosophy in different ways and a change in the way we did theology all happened. In the mechanical revolution, we now had the ability to create all kinds of things that people needed and to sort of wipe out the need for the basics of human existence, which is great. But as that strength kept being added to the system, as the efficiency increased, suddenly factories could create way more than people actually needed. And so the birth of modern marketing happened at this turn where we got over our need for the basic necessities of life in society, and where suddenly people could create far more than they needed, and they needed to sell more. So the marketing actually changes around 1900 from saying, oh, you need this thing because of its features, to you need this thing because it'll make you feel good. And this is where really modern materialism and consumerism comes into play, because now we can create way more stuff than we actually need. It's a direct outgrowth of the efficiency of this mechanical revolution. And then the digital revolution, we'll talk about this more in the next couple of weeks, is forming us in all kinds of ways. We're now moving away from the book as a system of complex linear thought, and moving back to images, moving back to video, moving back to other ways of processing information. Our attention spans for text are becoming way, way shorter because it's forming us as people. Each one of these technologies isn't just a neutral tool that we can use however we want. It brings its own grain, if you will, like a piece of wood, its own value system with it. And so what we have to do, next slide, is discern when we pick up a new technological tool, like a smartphone, like Zoom, like anything, what values is this technology carrying with it? What are the grains in this technology? How is it intended to be used? And then how do we cooperate with or subvert those values for the purposes of human flourishing? None of the tools are neutral in the sense that they're all shaping us. They all have values. How do we need to cooperate with those values? And how do we need to subvert those values for the purposes of human flourishing? Now, there's $1 million question there. What does it mean for humans to flourish? That's where the scriptures and the story of the gospel is a great gift to us, because we have a tool for what does it mean for humans to flourish where others are groping around in the dark for that. And that's where we're going to go next here in a second. But just as an example, to show you that the earliest believers were doing this, next page is one of the most interesting verses in scripture, I think, on technology, which is 2 John 12. I don't know when the last time you dove deep into 2 John 12 was, but here you go. It's one of these throwaway verses that we don't normally think about, but it's fascinating. John says, I have much to write to you, but I do not want to use paper and ink. Instead, I hope to visit you and talk with you face to face, so that our joy may be complete. So that our joy may be complete. Now, what's interesting is context, is that in this period, there were still those who were really reticent about the technology of writing in everyday life and upset that that had become a common technology. Socrates, for example, believed that the way to learn was in dialogue. And so he refused to write any of his teachings down, which is why we don't have any of them today, because he believed that the art of dialogue was better for teaching than the written words of pen and ink, because you couldn't interact with pen and ink, right? You couldn't go back and forth. You could only kind of passively receive it. So he was very against this new technology. So what technology is John using here in 2 John 12? He's kind of entering that cultural debate. Well, he's using paper and ink to write this letter, right? Why is he using it? What natural ability is he extending? Put it in the chat on the side. What natural ability is he extending? Why is he using the paper and ink? Yep. He wants to reach more people. He wants to cross greater distance. In one sense, he wants to extend his presence. This is a personal letter, right? So he's trying to extend his presence, which is trapped in his body. It's what's available to him. Absolutely. Chuck and Renee, absolutely. Extending his thoughts and communicating them when he could not otherwise. But he's nervous about this technology. Why is he nervous about paper and ink? Doesn't say outright, but it gives some hints. Yep, he can't interact and get input. What else? Why is he nervous about paper and ink? Aha, if body language is 80% of communication, yes, there's no body language in paper and ink. Yeah, it found if ever could get everybody in the church into trouble. That's true. Can't complete the joy, misinterpretation. Yep. Doesn't communicate his emotions. Same as why we'd rather be in person than in Zoom. Yep. Absolutely. So he's nervous about this because he recognizes it is less than the fullness of what could be. Ooh, too permanent. I like that. Less than the fullness of what could be. and he longs for that fullness. So one of the ways he subverts the technology is he decides not to write his version of the epistle to the Romans and lay out all the different things of the gospel from beginning to end. He says, I'm going to hold off and not use this technology to the fullest extent I could, so that I can protect the deeper value of being present with you that I want. It's a fascinating little piece of reflection. Fascinating little piece of reflection. What is John's vision of human flourishing? What does he most long for? He longs for the face-to-face. He longs to be in the presence of one another so that their joy may be complete. It's beautiful. Is it always possible in a world where we are finite and where things are broken? No. So technology allows us and allowed him to do things he wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. But yet there's a discernment here that says there are certain values in writing and certain values in face-to-face communication. And I recognize that. I want to be careful about how I'm pressing into those values. All right, well, let's stop here for a second. We're about to get into our primary tool for discernment, which is the gospel. How do we go about making the discernment about each one of these things? How does technology fit into this larger Christian story? Everything we've been doing so far is just sort of a general philosophy of technology. Would love to hear your questions or thoughts at this point. Feel free to unmute yourself and speak. You can also put it in chat if you want, but. Thoughts, reflections, questions.
How does a tool, if we're defining it the way that technology, the way that he defined it earlier, how does that impact how we worship? You know what I mean? Like if we're talking about making, like interacting with creation, if we're using that definition given, how does that impact worship?
Yeah, so worship is something we do in our created bodies, right? It's still like dealing with ourselves as created beings. So technology doesn't just work upon like an inner world, right? It also works on like other people because we're part of creation. We use technology with one another all the time. So this became a massive question. Well, let's start with an easy one, right? One of the things that every church has to discern is how, especially every liturgical church, is how are we going to get everybody to talk at the same time, right? Are we going to have a printed liturgy, or are we going to have the words up on the screen? Each one of those tools, because they're both tools, they're both technology, even though we only think of the screen as technology, right? They're both technology. Each one has certain values, right? Certain things that it's good at and certain things that it's bad at, if you want to think about it that way. A printed liturgy or a use of a book gives you a great sense of permanence and sort of settledness. Like this thing is true because it's been written down. That's what it is.
That's what mine now is.
What? Paul and Judy, you unmuted yourself. The screen gives a sense of impermanence, right? Like it kind of comes up and then it flits away and you can't remember what it was. But on a screen, everybody's looking up together at the same thing. If you have a paper in your hand, everybody's looking down at their own piece. So you have to balance the values of permanence versus unity of sight, right? They both have values that are pushing in a certain direction. The whole point of a screen is you're all looking there together. The whole point of a paper is you've got your own individual version. So in one sense, the printed bulletin is individualized, while the screen is a more communal activity. So these values are inherent in the technological form itself. Right? You can, again, values may not be the best word, grains, defaults maybe is another way to think about it, but the technology is pushing you, it is shaping you in a certain direction. Yeah.
And I just thought of an example that I just read about the other day. Actually, there are some churches that, because they can't meet in person, instead of meeting live stream or Zoom or whatever, they are not meeting. Right. And kind of saying God has taken this away from us. And so instead of bringing what they might call a cheaper substitute, they are choosing not to meet at all, right, as kind of like a fast or a form of discipline or something like that. So I just thought that was interesting, kind of like John is doing here, withholding something that he could be giving, but supposedly for the pursuit of something better.
Absolutely. So we have to make those determinations all the time when it comes to how are we discerning and using these things well. Zoom is another great example, right? Our conviction is that the church is fundamentally visible, fundamentally tangible, fundamentally communal. And when our gatherings were taken away, we had to decide, okay, what technology or none are we going to use to make a decision about what we do next? We went with Zoom fairly quickly. It didn't take us that long to land on it because it is the technological format that most clearly resembles the gathered, participatory, visible, tangible nature of what it means to be the church. But there are other values in Zoom which kind of are different from what we normally experience on a Sunday morning. Normally, you don't see everybody's faces. And some people have been uncomfortable with that, which is why you see some people, who turn off theirs or maybe turn off their screens or just focus on the main screen because it's actually distracting to them. So you're incorporating this other value of Zoom into your worship structure, even though you're getting all these other values of Zoom. It's shaping you in a certain way. And I think it might feel, once we get back in the sanctuary, maybe strangely anonymous to not see anybody else's face. Potentially. I mean, that'll be interesting to see how we've been shaped in this by the time all this is over. But that's an example. That's an example. Other questions?
Ken, I would ask a question.
Mm-hmm.
That would be,
yeah. I see you. I see your thumb.
Hooray. Technology has taken the Bible from paper, which to me is a very personal thing, to just some digits in a phone, which changes some of the character of actually the Word of God, I think.
So those two mediums of reading the Word absolutely have different values to them. So the book has less accessibility and less easy searchability, but it has more permanence. The phone has less permanence, but more easy searchability. So they each have values which push you to view the Word of God in certain directions and shape you to view it in certain ways.
Yes.
Some of the research they've done says that on a phone, you tend to read shorter chunks of scripture than if you're reading it in the actual Bible. Because when you see usually on a phone, you're like, oh, let's look up this verse. And you look up that verse, or maybe you look up the chapter. Whereas in the Bible, you see this chapter and the next chapter and the next chapter, et cetera. So it's just one of the ways it's shaping and forming us in ways like they're not, in other words, those two mediums, those two technologies, because they're both technologies, are not equivalent. They're not neutral. They're both shaping us in certain directions.
Yes.
Yeah, Ken?
Yeah.
This is Mark. I have a question, but wouldn't having it printed on a certain kind of paper in English also shape some values of it?
Oh, heck yes.
Or whether it's two column, single column, large print?
The fact that we have Bibles at all. Yes. So the number of columns that are there, the verse numbers and the chapter numbers that are there, those are all technological innovations. The fact that we have individual Bibles at all, like they did not have individual Bibles before the printing press. It is no surprise that around the time of the printing press, the Reformation took fire by these people who were trying to get people back in the text because now they all had their own text. Before that, the only way you got the word was in church, listening to it audially. That was the only way you got it. So in some weird way, our audio Bibles are actually taking us back to that day in a sense, except that now it's personalized and not a communal experience. But yeah, the Bible itself, taking it and having a copy in your home or 20 copies in your home or however much you have, that makes Bible reading an individual experience when there's some theological strands that would suggest that we've lost something, and that being an individual experience, even while we've gained things by it being an individual experience. Every technology is additive and subtractive. Matt Covey, let's see. I'd say because people create technology and their values pass into their creations. That is true that our technology is made with certain values in mind. I also think technology can take on a life of its own beyond what people expect it to do. I think the internet is an excellent example of that. I don't think the people who first created it had any idea of the ways it would affect all aspects of our society. The Arab Spring would have been impossible without the internet or social media, because people couldn't have coordinated by staying in their houses. Zoom was not created with worship services in mind. And yet, here we are. Here we are. All right, let's keep going. Feel free to put more questions over there in the chat. Hopefully this is giving you some categories by which to evaluate, and you're gonna have some homework at the end, so you're gonna need to keep some of this in mind. But we have to know, how do we go about this discernment? How do we decide, well, A, we got to figure out the values, the grain, how a technology is shaping us. But then we also then need to figure out, okay, well, what's the end that we're aiming for, and how is technology used in that? Our primary tool for discernment is the gospel. And as you read the whole narrative story of the scriptures, it's fascinating that you find that the gospel is not just good news for humanity, although it absolutely is that. It is also good news for creation, for the created world. All the creation is groaning in expectation for the renewal of the saints of God, Romans 8 talks about. But then also, it is good news for what humanity does with creation. It is good news for technology itself. There is a gospel story for the things we make. And that is amazing. And so walking through that will give us some insight into how do we make decisions about how we use the technology that we find ourselves in, and even how we create new technology. So the gospel story, for those of you who haven't been in one of my classes before, hopefully this gets redundant in the sense of I don't think we can ever go back to this format too many times. It is really helpful to think about any issue when it comes to scripture, not in terms of a proof text, but in terms of how does it flow through every single part of the story. Where do we see it in Act 1 of the biblical story, creation? Where do we see it in Act 2 of the biblical story, the fall? Where do we see it in Act 3 in redemption, basically the story from Genesis 4 onward, in a sense, all the way to Revelation, of how God used Israel and Jesus as the fulfillment of Israel to accomplish his work in the world. Act 5 is consummation. How are things all going to be made new in the end? And Act 4 is us. And the way I like to think of this is Acts 1, 2, 3, and 5. We all have a script for. We know the script of the play. We know the script of what God is doing. Act 4 is us, and it's improv. We don't have a script. We haven't been told exactly what we should do this day, this day. We haven't been told exactly what God is doing, exactly what God is doing in any given time. So it's our job to know Acts 1, 2, 3, and 5 of the story so well that we can improv Act 4 in a way that is faithful with the rest of the story. So we are bound by the rest of the story, but we also have freedom to figure out, how do we walk through this? How do we walk through this well? So what we're going to do is we're going to lay out how technology comes into Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, and Act 5. And hopefully that'll give us a paradigm for how do we discern well here. Act 1, creation. We are technological beings. We are technological beings. It is in our very nature to create technology. This is not something that is rebellion against God or something we shouldn't be doing. This is what God has given us to do. The image of God in Genesis 1:26 through 28, we are made in the image of God. In the text, there are kind of three aspects to that creation in the image of God. One is it said, let us make man in humanity in our image. There's a plural nature to that, just as there is a relationship forming aspect to the image of God. We're meant to be in relationship with one another. Then it says he created them male and female in his image. There's a life creating aspect, a fruitfulness aspect. So we are called to be fruitful and multiply, not just as, but in reflection of the God who is fruitful and multiplying, just as our relationships are a reflection of God as Trinity. But then there's also another aspect where we are called to subdue the earth. We are called to be kings and queens, princes and princesses over creation, to subdue the plants of the field and the animals and all the different aspects that means. This is often called the cultural mandate. And so it includes the intention that we would make things, that we would, in a sense, add to God's creation as co-creators. This becomes clear in Genesis 2 when God sets Adam in the garden, and it says he needs to do two things. He needs to work the garden. The word for it is basically the word for serve. He needs to till the garden. Basically, he needs to do something to the garden. But he also needs to keep the garden. He needs to guard the garden, which would suggest that he needs to keep the integrity of the world God has made. There's this double command: do something with this, improve on it, make it better. I've created it so that you can add to it, but don't add to it so much that you fundamentally change the nature of the thing, or it will bite back at you. These two really interesting commands. There's also worship context to those two commands. Those same words are used for worship. So everything that's done in the Garden of Eden is an act of worship, tying in with the Old Testament tabernacle. There's a million things you can say about those verbs. But it's a fascinating dichotomy of do something with this, but yet watch out. Be careful what you're doing with it. Naming the animals, language as a technology. God puts Adam down and says, okay, let's see what you do with this. Kind of creating the technology of language is the first time that Adam speaks, is in naming the animals. But God is the one who commands and encourages him to do that. All right, so at the base of the story is this is the kind of thing we're supposed to be doing. It's not bad. However, it goes bad. Act 2, fall. Almost immediately, technology becomes a means of extending our rebellion against God, right? If technology extends human capacities like strength, like thought, like et cetera, magnifies them, it also magnifies this aspect of who we are. Immediately in Genesis 3, you find the first clothing, which is a technology, right? A way to hide made out of the fig leaves. In Genesis 4, this really comes to the forefront. Usually when we're talking about the beginning of Genesis, we talk Genesis 1, 2, and 3, and then we kind of like skip to Noah, and we don't spend much time in Genesis 4. But in the story of technology, Genesis 4 is fascinating. So Cain kills Abel. He's sent out to wander in the land east of Eden, the land of Nod, which Hebrew scholars debate that all the time, what exactly that means. And then in verse 17, it says Cain was fruitful and multiplied and gave birth to Enoch. And then Cain built a city, which is fascinating. Up to now, everything has been agricultural, rural in a sense, in the ways that humanity's civilization has been described. Here, for the first time, you get a city. And through the Genesis narrative, most of the way through the Old Testament and even into the New Testament, unless you're looking forward to the future or unless you're talking about Jerusalem specifically, references to the city in Scripture are almost always negative. Almost always negative. There is some aspect of the city as a way to keep ourselves from that feeling of wandering east of Eden. Right? Cain is told, go wander east of Eden in the land of Nod. He's like, nope, I'm going to build a city. It's an act of self-protection in the text. And then, as the chapter keeps going, 7 generations down from Cain, you get Lamech, who has 3 kids. And this is in verse 20 of Genesis 4. Ada, which is one of Lamech's wives, gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. His brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all who played stringed instruments and pipes. Zillah also had a son, Tubal-Cain, who forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. Bronze and iron. There in the Scripture is your first technological revolution. First technological revolution right there. And it comes in the context of our rebellion against God and a line that rebelled against God. You can tell that that's still the case. Cain's descendants haven't exactly like magically transformed, because Lamech, these 3 sons' father, says, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. It's like not somebody you'd want to meet in a dark alley. Let's just put it that way. Like there's a deep sense of rebellion against God and rebellion against people happening here in the midst of this technological revolution. Tower of Babel, just extend the story out. Same kind of thing. Same kind of thing. Technological marvel, wonder of the world potentially, and done in rebellion against God in an attempt to not be dependent on him, but to be independent of him. So, like everything, technology is a good thing that becomes twisted when the people who use it and create it become twisted. But there's another aspect to this story, right? There's the aspect of redemption. God stepping in and changing the story of technology. Keep going, Act 3. Let's get to some good news. Technology is used over and over again in the Scriptures to limit the suffering of the fall. And we see that in our days, right? There is so much suffering from either our own sin, from the broken creation, etc. This whole category of things are not the way they're supposed to be. Our technology is a tremendous gift in limiting that suffering. There's no doubt about that. And God uses it redemptively in the same ways. But he also uses technology to move the story forward of his full redemption, not just limiting the effects of the fall, but actually moving redemption forward in fascinating ways. In Genesis 3, he takes their fig leaves and he says, I'm going to give you an operating system upgrade. I'm going to give you animal skins. Yes, now you have to hide from me, but I'm going to give you a different type of clothing. This is God making a new kind of technology in the text that is actually going to teach you something about how I'm going to redeem you. It's going to take death in order to redeem you here. There's an object lesson in what God creates for them there. In Genesis 6, right? God floods the earth and he says, Noah, get to building. Build that ark. And so God uses their technology to rescue Noah and his family from everything that's happening. I cannot help but think that's the technology we're using in this season. As frustrating as it is, and man, that ark must have been a hot mess in there. But yet, God is keeping us connected through this tool in this season. I think there's all kinds of examples of how he moves his story forward in that particular way. Another interesting picture of a new technology God using for redemptive purposes is actually writing. So between the 19th and 15th centuries BC, the world, well, this part of the world, transitioned from using hieroglyphic pictographs, these pictures that represent things, to a phonetic alphabet, to an alphabet where you use sounds based on certain marks and letters. And it made you able to communicate way more stuff in writing. Well, that is exactly the season. That happened in Egypt, Canaan, and Sinai, you can see there. That was happening at the exact same time that Israel was enslaved in Egypt. That's when those type of things were happening. So in one sense, Israel was enslaved in the Silicon Valley of their day in terms of the technology of writing. And so when they go out and leave Egypt and go into the wilderness, it is very specific. God says he's writing with his finger, writing on these stone tablets, his commands for them, his purpose for them. That medium, he could have just said, Moses, here are the 10 commandments, and then you repeat them back orally the way your culture is used to doing things. But instead, he writes them down so that they will be more permanent. Can't play telephone game with something that's written on 2 tablets. I mean, yes, he busted it once, then he made another one, but you get my idea. Like in terms of like, you can't, like once it's etched, you can't change it. But they're also accessible to everyone. That knowledge is no longer confined in the person of Moses. It is now accessible to anyone who can read. And if Moses is having a bad day or he's sick, you can like still access it. That's a new technological medium of that time with new values associated with it that God actually uses to communicate something about himself. These words are unchanging, and these words are for all of you. Okay, you can keep playing that out in this season with metallurgy. Let's see, next slide. With metallurgy, craft, and the creation of the tabernacle. In Exodus 31, it explicitly says that Bezalel and Aholiab are filled with the Spirit of God to create the tabernacle. And there's all kind of metalwork and weaving and all kinds of things happening. But God says, as the second commandment, do not make a graven image of me. It's a different kind of technology at play in sculpture, in created things, than was present in writing. Writing works in different ways than physical images work. And there's all kinds of ways that happens, and we're going to talk about that in future weeks. But even God here is making a technological discrimination and saying, you can make all kinds of things that point to me, that set the table for me, that are my home, that are my dwelling place, that remind you of me, etc., but do not make an image of me. You can write about me all you want. I'm telling you what I am like in writing, but don't make an image of me. Different technological form communicates something different. And he uses those technological forms to communicate different things about himself. When you get in the New Testament, I mean, things abound. The cross is a technology of execution. It was designed specifically for a purpose to degrade everyone who underwent it. And yet, God turns that evil, vile human technology into the sign of our redemption. Roads, seafaring, letters. You could not write the book of Acts without those 3 things being front and center in terms of how the gospel gets out. God uses each one of those technological innovations. In church history, the codex and the scroll, we assume that the Bible was always kind of like the Bible. But in Jesus's day, everything was written on scrolls. When it talks about when he goes to the synagogue in Nazareth, he unrolls the scroll and then puts it back. The codex was a technological innovation. It was around a little bit, starting in the 100s and 200s, really overtook the scroll in probably the 300s. And it allowed you to put way more text into one bound thing and change the way people viewed the Bible from all these assorted scrolls to one book or a couple books, which everything could be bound up in. The lists of books in the New Testament really became important when you needed to know what leaves do I put in the codex, because now we can keep this whole set of sacred writings together, as opposed to, well, I've got the James and you've got the Corinthians and you've got the this and this. Oh, we can put it all together now. Where should they be? That technological innovation mattered a ton. Okay, Act 5. Where's the story going? Almost all the positive implications you see of the city are in reference to Act 5, consummation in the scriptures. There is a redemption of humanity's attempt to create life independent and apart from God in our technology that is full and complete and total. In Isaiah 2, 1 through 3, it says that the nations are going to stream to Judah and Jerusalem. And this is a positive thing because they're all going to learn about the word of the Lord. In Revelation 21, it's a city that comes down from heaven to earth. We don't go back to the garden again. We don't go back to the uncultivated land. We actually go to a world of development, of transformation. It has the garden in the center of it, but it's been built by human acts of creation. Right? Our tools get redeemed. In Isaiah 2:4, it explicitly says that our swords are going to be beat into plowshares. It doesn't say that the swords are going to go away. This tool of violence that we have created becomes transformed into a tool of cultivation once again. It says in Revelation 21 that all the gifts, what does it say specifically? The glory of the nations. Let me just read this. This is a fascinating verse. It's talking about the city. Let's see. Revelation 21, verse 24. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their splendor into it. On no day will its gates ever be shut, for there will be no night there. The glory and honor of the nations will be brought into it. The idea is that the greatest things about these nations that have been on earth are somehow going to be welcomed into the new creation, the new city, and are somehow going to be used there in some way. Whatever evil or purposes that they were used in rebellion against God will be shifted and transformed so that they now become tools of flourishing and cultivation. There's a good case to be made that there will be continuing uses of technology in the new heavens and the new earth, that we will still be making and creating things, still be tilling the earth and keeping it in the new heavens and the new earth. So this story is headed somewhere. Crucially, it's not headed towards either the end of technology will save us, which is a major worldview that is out there today. Any problem we have, let's do a new technology and that'll fix it. It's also not headed to the world is going to fall apart in a stinking pile because we're all on our phones too much. Right? Technology is not going to do us in and come back and eat us either. There's a story in which all our technology, like everything else, is redeemed and becomes part of God's kingdom. So these acts are our tools for discernment. With any one of our technological tools, we can use these acts and think through, how is this a reflection of God's created intent? What are some ways that this technology can actually magnify the fall? What are some ways this technology will be redeemed? And what are some ways that what will this technology look like in the new creation? What will it look like when it's made new and all it does is draw us to God. So in these next couple slides, I've included some reflection questions from this book, which I found very helpful for each act of the story. Some questions that help us discern about any of our technological tools. For creation, what unique aspects of God's nature does this technology reflect? Right? Because if we're made in the image of God, made to create, then it's going to reflect something about God's nature. What aspects of our human nature does this technology enhance and extend? How does this help accomplish the creation mandate? Is this tool used primarily to create new things or to consume things that already exist? That's fascinating. Because our mandate is to subdue and to create. Sometimes our technology can make us more passive instead of being active in those ways. What patterns have emerged over time as this has taken hold in society? What are the values of this technology? If you go to fall, you've got another set of questions. Next slide, Mark, which are very similar. What obvious negative uses? What embedded values are in conflict with the biblical portrait of humanity? What will happen if we use this technology too much? What limits do we need to place to prevent it from using us? Keep going. Redemption and restoration. 2 slides of questions that just help us think through the different acts of the story and how they apply to the specific technology we're thinking about. Okay, so you can do this as a case study for Zoom. Go back, Mark. Go back to the creation questions.
It'll take a second here. Hold on.
I forgive you. So in creation,
There we go.
what aspects of our human nature does Zoom enhance or extend? Write it in the chat. Yep. Absolutely. That relational desire that we have for one another, this allows us to extend into that in at least some form, right? To extend our presence over space, not fully, not completely, but it is trying to extend that, right? That's one of the values of the technology. All right, but let's keep going. Go to the fall page. Let's see. What will happen if we use this technology too much? What will happen if we use Zoom too much? Indeed. Absolutely. Yep. Good. All very good things. Yes. I mean, there is a sense, and we'll talk about this a little bit next week. There's a sense in which Zoom is so close to our normal community that our normal experience of relationship, in the sense that we see each other's faces, we talk back and forth, that we wonder why we get so tired from using it. Well, part of the reason is so much of our communication comes from actually being embodied and reading people's nonverbal communication. And I am working so hard to look at your faces and figure out, what are you thinking in this moment that I normally wouldn't? I could just take a glance and I could have it. Now I got to be like, oh, okay, well, this page is looking pretty good. Let me go over to the next page. It's exhausting because it's so close and yet so far. And one of the things that we can use Zoom for, I think somebody said this over here, was that we can actually hide from it. Like, we can actually hide through it. We can be present without actually being present. It's even worse on a live stream. This is why we went with Zoom as opposed to a live stream for all of our worship services. But you can still hide. You can kind of put on a face and have it, but you can be doing your email on the side, and et cetera, and not actually be present. Okay, let's go to redemption, though. Redemption and restoration. All right. What effects of the fall can this technology help to overcome? COVID. That one's easy. Let's see. Keep going to the next page. Some more questions on the next page. Yeah. So is it possible to use the technology in a different way to avoid those problems? If not, how does the presence of such problems help us long for the future restoration of all things through Christ? So again, Zoom for us is using the technology in a way not to replace embodied presence, but to substitute for embodied presence as much as we possibly can for as long as we need it. But there are none of us who are sitting around going, we will never need to be in church ever again, right? This actually makes us long for deeper connections. And that's part of the story of restoration that's woven into it. Zoom is not meant to be the end in itself. It is meant to point us towards a rehumanization of communication, and in the hope that we will one day fully be face-to-face in a way that we can't right now and can't even honestly be on Sunday mornings, like towards a greater relational capacity than we can even have in the flesh. Another one of the redemptive things about Zoom is you get to see people who have moved on to the next place. And even like it's a some ways a better picture of heaven than even Sunday morning is, because you get to see people who have moved on and come back. So there's redemptive angles to all of it. Yeah. Awesome, Arthur. I agree. Hopefully we can yell at each other here soon in the park. All right, so kind of homework for next week. Kick on down. Here's what I want you to do. And then we'll do some questions. You made it sound like Zoom gets to talk with the dead. No, but maybe people that are dead to us we get to talk to because they've moved far away. Pick one technology, modern or ancient. So like books would count under this. The spinning wheel would count in this. Or your cell phone or Zoom or something else. And evaluate it according to those acts of the story. Think through, how does this reflect our created purpose? Think through, oh man, how could we use this to be independent of God and independent of others, even if its stated purpose is something else? Think through, what are the possible redemptive aspects of this technology? And how would this technology end up looking in the new heavens and the new earth? What would be a perfected form of this that wouldn't fight back, that wouldn't shape us in such negative ways? Or what would the fulfillment of that technology be? So next week, we'll have a few of you, not everybody has to share, but we'll have a few people share on their technology and the way that they see that story playing out for their particular piece of the things we humans have made. And then we will get into digital technology more fully, and some specific ways that digital technology shapes us and that we need to be aware of so we can engage it as redemptively as possible. We'll do that for the last 2 weeks because that's what most of us are thinking when it comes to technology. Why we love it so much and why we hate it so much simultaneously. Yeah. Yep, the weeds are a great example of being in church, even though they have moved. It's been great to see them. And can I briefly summarize Act 5? Act 5 is consummation. It's the renewal of all things. So Revelation 21 and 22, it's all things being made new again. And you've got access to all these slides if you want, Peter, in the chat function at the top. So, and I can send that out again. All right, questions or thoughts? Yes, so you have these questions and the assignment from the link, and I can send this out again. In your email, you'll have access to all these slides, so you can look at all the slides as you're going. Yep, and there it is again. Good job. All right, any other questions or thoughts? Feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself. And if anybody needs to go, that's totally fine. Thanks for coming. I can stay on a few minutes later. But yeah, we've got 4 minutes before 8, so.
I'm
I'm
just
gonna go help put kids to bed, but thanks for doing this, and it's fun to see you all, even though I don't know everybody, but it's fun to be in community in isolation. So
Indeed. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks,
Appreciate
Ken.
you, brother. Mary Beth.
I was just thinking, like, of all the technologies that we could say that we don't, I mean, technology's bad, right? We could say that, but I don't think most of us would say indoor plumbing or toilets are.
Right. Yep.
You know, those would be interesting case studies.
Absolutely. And it'd be interesting to go back to the way, they have shaped us in potentially less than salutary ways. Obviously.
How that impacts like our current world versus, like, I'm just thinking of being in Rwanda and finding a squatty potty on a hill somewhere, right?
Yep.
That really shapes your community pretty significantly.
It does. It does. Now, this is a bit of trivia about me. I was born, just to date myself here, 1984. Date myself young, and I went to a church. I went to a church out in the country, Edgewood United Methodist Church, and by the name Edgewood, you should know, like that was about right. It was at the edge of the wood. And we still had, up until I was probably 6 or 7, squatty potty in the back in a little shed. We had no indoor plumbing in the church. And I still remember going out to that.
Yep.
I mean, not that long ago, even in some parts of the US and some buildings like that. I remember when we put that on the back of the church. And that shapes and forms things in different ways. I mean, we think of bathroom time now as kind of private time. At least we do in my family, because all the kids, like, that wasn't a place you wanted to linger before, like, you know, in that kind of setting. It's just, it definitely changes things.
I'm still pondering what you said about technology. I get it that technology shapes us, and so in that way it's not neutral. But when I think of neutrality, I think of that as being neither good nor bad. But I don't know that we can say, can we say that the shaping is going to be either good or bad?
So what I would say is that, like humans, I'm not sure that we can say that we are either good or bad. And so I'm not sure the things we create are either good or bad. I think it's probably a mix of both, like in the ways they shape us and shape the world, because there are beautiful ways that our technology shapes the world, that makes things possible that wouldn't be otherwise possible. But there are also harmful ways that technology shapes. And I think that is probably true for everything that is created. So I think you can have that dual view of technology, just like we have a dual view of us. I think those two can match. And so, like, for this, like, it's beautiful and it's good. It's total depravity still applies.
So your original question is technology good, bad, or neutral? Is there a fourth option then?
Oh, absolutely. It's a total trick question.
Oh, okay. I like it better. Thank you.
Total trick question, in the sense that, like, it depends on how you're defining the terms, but it gets you thinking about, like, how technology works, and is there moral value to technology, and et cetera. But I think the key point from that is technology does both, but it's not just the content. Like, one of the mistakes we make is that, well, if I'm looking at good things on my phone, then my phone is good. And if I'm looking at bad things on my phone, then my phone is bad. It's not that simple. The medium of the phone, the technology of the phone, is also doing potentially good and bad things to us simultaneously. Not just the content, but the actual mechanism through which we are receiving that content is shaping us in healthy and unhealthy ways. And part of that's dependent on how much we use it and et cetera. But the medium itself, the technology itself, does do something. The Bible is the Bible on the phone, just like it is in a book. But we start to view the Bible differently based on whether it's in the phone or in the book. Yeah. And that's what we've got to be more discerning about.
It's interesting, Ken, just a comment, and that is, we do know that technology changes how our brain works and changes the neural connections in the brain.
Yep. Absolutely does. Because, and this is where we're in the midst of a great experiment, and that's why we'll talk about it the next 2 weeks. We have never had a technological form quite this powerful. Because what internet just by itself does, internet combines the technology of the book, see if I can get this right, the book, the photograph, the telegraph, and the phonograph, all in one item where it's in your pocket constantly. We took all the major inventions of like, you know, the late 1800s and early 1900s, and we shoved it all in our pocket and like put it on turbo power. And so we don't even know what this does to us yet, really. Like, we're not even sure what effects it has on us. We're like a massive experiment right now that's playing out society-wide. And so for a moment like this in the pandemic, it's kind of awesome. But yet, what are the implications of this? Where does it go from here? Do people start demanding we live stream Sunday morning worship when we come back from this? I mean, this is the all kinds of questions, you know what I mean, in the midst of this, and we don't even know. So that's why there are some hard and fast things in the midst of this, but a lot of it's just, we're in the midst of a huge experiment. Let's pay attention and let's figure out what this is doing to us.
I wonder if the Christians who carried around the scrolls would be saying the same thing. These guys that have the Bible in a book, they have no idea what it's doing to them and what the things are.
Totally.
Some of this is perspective that way. You know,
absolutely.
I was sharing with my group, you know, churches have railed against the evil of the radio, the TV, the computer. This has gone on for hundreds of years.
Yep.
This discussion.
Yep, absolutely. Every time something new comes up, this same conversation happens. Again, this is like a quantum leap in many different ways. But it happens in every generation, and every time I think some good things come out of it, and I think some potentially destructive things come out of it. I mean, we complain about the individualism of the church. You know what I mean? Like, oh, like it's so like everybody's doing their own thing and community is so hard. The revolution to everybody having their own individual Bible, and you can meet with God just with your own individual Bible, that technology undercuts community. Mm. It absolutely undercuts it. I've wanted to say, I've never had the chutzpah, but as a sermon illustration to say, nobody can look at a Bible for a week in the whole church except this one. And we've got to figure out how we get it to everybody. And when you had it for 3 hours that you had it, what would you be doing with it? You'd be like all in it. You'd be copying it. You'd be writing it down. So you've got verses to memorize, et cetera. You take it way more seriously. There's such a thing as like over accessibility. But there's also great things about having your own Bible. So it's a both and, but each one of those technologies like does good things and it does bad things. And we just need to pay attention. And it's the digital immigrants who have the best shot at that. The digital natives have the hardest time because it's just natural to them. We don't think about the technology of books and how that shaped us. I keep using that example to kind of not just talk about phones all the time. But we don't realize always how, if we're natives to something, we don't think about it as much.
I go onto the internet to do something and I come off the internet. My children stay attached to the internet.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Absolutely.
It's like when we went from horse to car. Because when we went from horse to car, the roads had to change. We didn't have gas stations. We didn't have hotels. And you could say almost overnight, very similar to where we are now, only we don't know what the new roads are like per se. We might have an inkling, but there's some unknown territories ahead.
Totally.
And when you look at the transformation of car to road, horse to road for the car, I think that there were whole echelons of society that just they kind of imploded, and then people were like, okay, we got to invent something. So
cars were huge. I mean, again, just to go back to isolation in this season, like our density of how our cities are built, especially Colorado Springs, because Colorado Springs was mostly built after the car. We're so darn spread out because we had a car. Like, if you didn't have a car, we couldn't be this spread out. It would be completely impractical. European cities were built before the car, so they're much more dense, where American cities and suburbs tend to be built after the car, and they're much more open. It totally changes the nature of your entire society, how churches work. I grew up in the South, and all the little Methodist churches were built 5 miles from one another, so everybody could get there either walking or on horseback. So you had like trillions of little Methodist churches everywhere. Well, they're all, I mean, 2 out of the 3 churches on the circuit that I grew up on are all gone now because the car just demolished it, because you can drive 20 minutes into town and go to church. Massive changes based on the car. Anything else? Comments? Thoughts? Oh, there was one over here. Through the eyes of Amish communities. Yep. They examine each tech from the angle of how it impacts the family. How they are dealing with tech now is very interesting. Yeah, I mean, they definitely are on the conservative end of that spectrum, but they are people who think, you know, much more intensely about technology. And it's kind of funny the things they pick and choose. I'm not sure they're always like completely consistent in the ways they process these things, but they definitely take more discernment about it than most of us do. That's for sure. Something to be thought through there. Anything else? To Matt's question, I think we would have had technology without fall. I think we would have, because I don't think the Garden of Eden, we talk about the Garden of Eden created as like perfect, but it wasn't. It was morally perfect, and our relationship with God was perfect, but it wasn't perfect in the sense that it didn't need someone to work it. There was something that needed to happen there, and God designed it that way on purpose. Anything else? Yeah, feel free to go if you need to go. Thanks for coming.
Well, thank you for your thought-provoking presentation. Very good.
Thanks. It's been fun to think through. As I said, it's really made me more reflective on this stuff, and we'll get more into the phones and stuff here coming up. But it's good to get some of these basic things down, because sometimes we reduce this conversation to just one type of tech when it's actually a much larger conversation.
Yep.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Great to see you guys. Anything else? Any other convos?
I just sent you an email of one of my favorite technological advance reactions. It's monks opening a book.
Oh, fun. Can't wait to see it. Good. Can't wait to see it.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I'll see you guys later. Have a great night. Thanks for
Ken.
coming. Thanks for suffering through more time on Zoom to talk about Zoom. There's a certain
My 4th hour today.
there's a certain irony about having a class about technology and how we got to pay attention to it over Zoom. I'm liking the meta nature of this conversation.
Ken, have you read the Kurt Thompson article?
Yes.
Okay, I figured you had.
Yep, that is going everywhere right now.
Because it's brilliant. It's brilliantly.
He struck a chord. Yep. No, my capacity for Zoom is increasing, but it is definitely like I'm way more tired after a time on Zoom than I am meeting with people. So today I had meetings straight from like 1 to 5:30 on Zoom, and then this tonight. So like my capacity is increasing, but it's definitely like, yeah, I just miss people. Yes.
Sleep well.
Yeah. But I'm thankful for it at the same time.
Right? It's great.
Yeah. All right. Peace.